I got interested in the subject of Bigfoot by a movie at a walk-in theater with my older brother and my older sister. And it was called The Legend of Boggy Creek. The way I recall it was about 1973, and in 1973, more or less, I was 10 or 11 years old, born in 63. And at that time in our lives, because we were all kids, we were into those horror movies on TV like Godzilla, Rodan. They were fascinating movies, horror flicks to watch. I was kind of under the impression when we were going to go see The Legend of Boggy Creek, it was going to be sort of that type of theme. When I saw the movie, it kind of, as I've expressed to other people before, it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks because I couldn't believe, for one, that they were presenting this information as if it were factual, that these people in Arkansas, around Fouke, Arkansas, were having these encounters with these hairy man-like beasts. And being 10 years old, I was inquisitive, skeptical. I had a lot of things running in my head. So I had a library card at the Norwalk Public Library. And so myself and my best friend across the street, we went over and we asked the librarian if we could find some books on Bigfoot and stuff like that, because we kind of figured it out. That's probably what they're talking about. So that's how I got introduced into the subject.
Hello, everybody. I am Erick Szylagyi. I'm the host and producer of the Uncomfortable podcast. It started out as a paranormal podcast, everything under the sun, and about a year and a half into it, 70-some shows, and over 50% of them have been Bigfoot related. The vast majority of those episodes are from Michigan. Now, I live in South Bend, Indiana, which is right at the state line, so 90 times out of 100, when I turn out of my neighborhood, I go into Michigan. So I'm kind of like a Michigan transplant. When I had my kids, we lived there. And so it's just, Bigfoot has been a huge part of my paranormal journey since I was a kid. I think 7 years old, I got this book in our library at grade school, and the first half of the book was about Bigfoot. The second half was about Loch Ness Monster. Everybody in this room probably has seen that book. So early on, I was really fortunate to have an incredible story come my way. And if I would encourage any of you who are interested in podcasts to go to Uncomfortable Podcasts and listen to episodes 2 and 3. It's called Opening Day. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but it's really an amazing tale. But what I wanted to share with you to kind of get the ball rolling, I think it was my 5th episode. I decided to do an episode with a Native American witch. It wound up being the 3 strangest hours of my life. It was filled with all kinds of historical anecdotes. She could trace both sides of her family way, way back. And we talked about her magic, practicing witchcraft. And then she started talking about Bigfoot, specifically on her property. And this is in southwest Michigan. She took me into a room where we decided to do the interview. Rarely do I do interviews in person. It's usually over a phone because there's always quite a distance. She lived relatively close to me, so I went to her house. She took me into this room. We closed the door. And the one wall was all windows, and it faced out to a field. You ever drive by a farm, and it's all plowed fields, but then you see an acre of trees, and I've always wondered, why do they do that? Well, during the middle of the conversation, she was in the middle of a sentence, literally finishing the word and something something came through the wall and the window and permeated that room that was so loud, so bombastic, that, and it's happening now as I'm talking about it, every inch of my body went to chill bumps. My hair stood on end, hair on the back of my neck stood up. And the first thought that went through my head was, shit, I left my gun out in the car. Immediately followed by, shit, I got 40 pounds of dog food in my back seat. Two very strange thoughts to go through my head from hearing a sound. Now, as I said, I have a podcast, and I have invested a good deal of money in that podcast equipment. I was sure that my equipment picked up that sound. When it happened, both her and I reacted. We both turned towards the windows that it came from. And I can't tell you how loud it was. It was incredible. And both of our bodies reacted to it. On the way home, I'll take this one step further. As I was leaving her house, she walked me out to the car. I was loading my equipment, and she stood at the front of my car, and she looked back at the woods behind her property, and she put her hands up like this and went, whoop. And I'll be damned. From way off on the other side of the stream, you hear whoop. And then way over there, whoop. And she turned around and she looked at me and she said, isn't that cute? Isn't that neat? And I was like, I don't know. Is it? Is it neat? Because it scared the hell out of me. Yeah. So I got in my car. I had about a 35-minute drive home. I immediately called my son. And I said, buddy, you got to talk me off the ledge here because I don't know what the hell just happened. And he's like, what? What's going on? And I said, well, I'm doing the interview, just like I told you. I get to the part where this sound hits us. And he starts asking me a bunch of questions. He's like, well, what did it sound like? Was it a whoop? Was it a call? Was it a scream? What was it? What was it? And finally I had a man like, shut up. Quit asking me. I don't know. I can't explain it to you. All I can tell you is how my body reacted. So he talked me down. We talked the rest of the way home. I got home and I immediately took my SD card out of my equipment, put it into my computer. I'm like, I got to get this on here. I got to hear this. And there's nothing. There is her interrupting a sentence after saying the word and. And when she hits the letter D at the end of and, you hear this tiny little ooh. And I was like, and you can hear our reactions on the recording. I say, what the hell was that? And she goes, did you hear that? And I'm like, yes, I heard it. I'm like, look at my arms. So, we're talking through the whole experience of it. It's not on the tape. So I isolate that, about 10 seconds of it. And I start monkeying with it, trying to get higher levels on it, trying to reduce background noise. And I played it for a friend of mine. And they're like, yeah, I hear it. I couldn't hear it. And then I played it for somebody else, and they're sitting probably as far away from me as Shelley is. They're listening to it on their phone, my phone in their hands, and I can hear it clear as a bell. It is the weirdest damn thing. It has such an odd acoustic quality to it that 9 out of 10 times when you listen to it, you might get a little woo. You might not hear anything. And then from 20 feet away, you can hear it clear as a bell. And it took me about 3 or 4 days of trying to figure out what the hell happened. And then it hit me. You talk about infrasound, the possibility that these things use infrasound. And then the description came to my mind. It hit me like a wave. It was like this, and then it kind of released a little bit. And then it came back, but it wasn't as strong as it was. Not the sound. It was like an electrical, weird electrical feeling, because I don't know if you can see my arm, but I got chills again. And it just kept coming back. And each time it came back, it was a little bit less. And then a little bit less. And then a little bit less. And at the end of it, I don't know how many times it happened, 3 or 4 times, and it was gone. And I didn't have any more. So it finally dawned on me, I know what people mean when they say they got zapped. Because it was, in the best of my recollection, it was an electrical manifestation. Whatever it did to my body felt electrical. So that's about it for me.
I'm Daniel Perez, age 58, born and raised in Southern California, the Los Angeles area. Grew up in a city called Norwalk. I still live in the area. My occupation since 1985 as a professional work has been a union licensed electrician. I'm still in that occupation and I'm not retired, so we work in the field. We build little buildings that you've probably never heard of, like Apple, Microsoft, Google. We do those. Sooner or later, you'll hear about those companies. So that's what we do, and it's been a good profession for me. It's allowed me to travel a little bit and to do a few things with my life. And so I'm stationed in Southern California. This is my second time to Michigan. I was here in 1996, and let me tell you a little bit about myself, because right after I tell you a little bit about myself, I'm going to be telling you about 2 of the most famous Bigfoot Sasquatch investigators that have ever been on the planet, both from Canada, Rene Dehinden and John Green. They were personal friends and colleagues of mine. I started collecting. My dad took the LA Times back when people took newspaper subscriptions. He had the LA Times or the LA Herald Examiner, I forget which one, maybe both. But I would oftentimes look at the newspaper, and every once in a while there was no internet back then. There would be a newspaper article about Bigfoot, and I would take my scissors and cut it out, and we shopped our shoes at JCPenney. Remember that store? And so I had a shoebox, so that was my first filing cabinet. I started putting those in a shoebox, my newspaper clippings. And so at this point, in terms of my physical files, they are the largest in the world, period, flat out. There's nobody that has bigger physical files in the world than me. So when people start talking about Michigan, yeah, I know a little bit about Michigan. I've got files on Michigan. I've been following it. And so let me get away from talking about myself a little bit and talk to you about Michigan. So when I came here in 96, I was originally, what I did is I bought a motorhome in 96, 95, and then in 96, the Olympic Games were in Atlanta, Georgia. And so I'm a big track and field guy, and so I've seen, I guess, 8 editions of the Summer Olympic Games. And so in order to get away from paying the rent on a hotel or whatever, I said, well, I'll just drive my motorhome over. And the way I remember it, gas was maybe less than $1 then, or right around $1. It wasn't too bad even at that time. So I drove over here to Atlanta, and then I spent a lot of money on the Olympic Games and had a good time. And then I went to the Union Hall, and they said, I said, hey, wouldn't it be neat to work over in this part of the country for a little bit, because this might be the first opportunity to ever do so. And so they said, oh, Brother Dan, you need to go up to Toledo, Ohio. They've got a walkthrough, meaning that you could just walk into the Union Hall, pick up your job ticket, and go right out. And so I get up to Toledo, Ohio, I walk into the Union Hall, and by then the dispatch was already closed or done for the day. And I said, well, here I am, I'm signing in for work. And they said, the lady threw out a stack of tickets, and she says, we have these jobs that still need to be filled. Do you want one? And I said, that's what I came for. So I got a job the very same day that I showed up at the Union Hall. And they dispatched me to General Mills, and I think it was in Sylvania, Ohio. Is anyone from Ohio? You kind of know maybe where that is. That's where I got dispatched to. And then when that job ended, I went back to the Union Hall, and I got another job, and this one took me up to Monroe, Michigan, because in Ohio, Local 8, the jurisdiction also goes into Michigan. So I went up to Monroe to a power plant. Actually, it may have been a little further north. But as I was driving through Monroe, it dawned on me that a famous Bigfoot incident had happened in that area, and her name was, let me think of it real quick. I mentioned it to someone earlier. Christine Van Aker is her name, and it happened in August of 1965. And she made, she went to the police with her account, but prior to that, or let me just back up just a minute. We're talking about Michigan now, and that her son, just the other day at Phil Shaw's house, I was on the internet, and I went on YouTube, and I think I Googled or put in Monroe Monster or whatever, and her son made a YouTube video about what transpired, and apparently her mom isn't talking. Her mom is still living of what happened. And so prior to her sighting in a vehicle with her mother riding shotgun, I guess there was an earlier stage, according to the son, that it was first her and her 3 girlfriends literally out looking for this monster at night. And I guess they heard growls, according to the YouTube video. And I guess those girls got dropped off, and her mom got in the car, and they were out. And one of these things, I guess a Bigfoot, had come up to the vehicle and apparently put its hand through the windows, which were down on the Impala car. And I'm assuming it gave her a black eye by just putting the palm right into her face, because there's a photo of her that's in several Bigfoot books, early Bigfoot books, of her with the black eye, and she's still living. And I'm just assuming that she received so much ridicule over the years that she kind of probably stopped talking about it. I never spoke with her. In 1996, I was thinking about work, and I guess I was kind of lazy. I probably could have went to the local library and found a book on Bigfoot and tried to track her down, but back then it probably wouldn't have been a good idea just showing up at her door and saying, hey, I'm Dan Perez. I'd like to talk to you about what happened in 1965. You'd probably just have the door shut in your face. So I've never spoken to her, but I reached out to her son last night because there was an email attached to the YouTube video, and I said, I'd like to talk to you or possibly talk with your mom, because this incident's been over 50 years, and it'd be nice to see if she's still sticking with her story. So that's possibly one of the most famous incidents that's ever happened here in the state of Michigan, right there in Monroe, or right there on the outskirts of Monroe, and it's very compelling in my opinion. The fact that the son would have a YouTube video up talking about her mom, his mom, and she goes, I grew up hearing this story from my mom on numerous occasions. So that's one story. So I'm going to tell you another story. So in '96, the 2 main people in Michigan believe it or not, back then people communicated with postal letters. And so we would get postal letters, and they were actually pretty efficient. So I was in touch already with two people in the state of Michigan that, as far as I know, are still living. Art Capoff from Mayville and Wayne King from Caro or Flint, Michigan. And I believe he's about 82 now, but probably no longer has his foot on the gas pedal of Bigfooting anymore. But in the late 70s, there was an incident in Dansville, if I'm saying it correctly, Dansville, Michigan. Does anyone know where that is? Okay, so I was Googling this last night because I happened to see this in Phil Shaw's scrapbook of newspaper clippings. And because I go through so much data that a lot of this stuff over the decades gets lost on me. And so there was an incident where the couple, who's now deceased, it looked like the husband passed away in 2006 at age 93, and the wife, Valerie, passed away, I think, in 1986, much earlier. But they're both gone now. They reported to Wayne King, who was an investigator and worked for the United Auto Workers, I guess, as a steel pressman or something like that, that, where was they going? That they never saw anything on their property, but there was a handprint that was left somewhere. Wayne King came out to investigate and photograph and take measurements. And so that handprint was 11 inches. So there's 11, there's my hand right there. So you could kind of see the difference. 11 inches by 7 inches wide. And then there was another handprint that was recorded in Fort Bragg, California from February of 1962. And we've had, for the people who get the Bigfoot Times newsletter, we've had many editions almost back to back on the breaking news of a very old case from Fort Bragg. And that handprint was 11 and a half inches long. So just a ginormous handprint, and it doesn't look like just an expanded version of a person's handprint. It looks quite a bit different once you start to look at it. And so in this instance, in Dansville, Wayne King went to investigate, and he says, I'm not going to be releasing the photos until they're copyrighted. I don't think that if they ever saw the photos ever saw the light of day in a newspaper article. But I'll be writing to him. I haven't been in touch with him for a million years and asking if he could release this information, because this is the data that drives the idea that Bigfoot could possibly be a real species. And so I wanted to talk to you. So that's another case, and that happened in the late 1970s. But that's the type of information, that's the type of evidence that makes the case for Bigfoot compelling. But in general, most people, when you have that conversation at the restaurant, the sidewalk, or at your neighbor's place, you go, I believe in Bigfoot, I don't believe in Bigfoot. You know, you might be talking to your neighbor and this is, I've seen one, I believe in it, and your neighbor might say, you know what, I've lived here all my life too, I don't believe it. And so all I could tell you something about belief is that, how can I say it? Belief doesn't really mean anything to me, because how many of you believe right now that in my right pocket I have a dollar bill? And so the rest of you probably don't believe that, but if I kind of empty my pocket, there's nothing there. So what I'm trying to tell you is that it doesn't matter what you believe in the case for Bigfoot. You might say, well, I believe it's an outrageous idea, but there's still people here in the United States and Canada claiming to have seen these creatures. And Ken Gerhard has already given a very thorough description about the description of them physically. And so I've been investigating for decades, and I've been publishing my newsletter for almost a quarter of a century. And so let me just tell you, give a plug for the newsletter, the Bigfoot Times. I started publishing the first edition of that newsletter in January of 1998. And so other people at the time also had printed newsletters that were being mailed out to a subscriber base. There was one in California, there was one in Ohio by Don Keating, I think two of them in Ohio. Ron Schaffner, I think, had a newsletter as well, and a few other people. And so I thought that some of the newsletters could be tightened up in terms of the level of scholarship, the level of accuracy. So I said, I will throw my hat in that ring and see if I could produce a newsletter better or just as good as what they're doing about the topic of Bigfoot and have a constant variety of topics about it. And so as time went on and the internet got bigger and everything went online, the idea of a printed newsletter just didn't seem to go anymore. And their subscriber bases, I guess they stopped publishing, they ceased publishing, because the Bigfoot Times is the last of its kind. So all in one sentence, it's the best newsletter in the world, and it's the worst newsletter in the world because it's the only one in the world now. And so we have subscribers all over the world, and I'm happy to be publishing it. It comes out every year. So I wanted to talk now, I'm leading into John Green and Rene Dehinden. Have most of you heard of these individuals? Very famous. They're some of the pioneers in the investigation. And so when I went to the library looking for these books originally on Bigfoot, by 1975, Rene Dehinden with Don Hunter had his first book out in hardback, Sasquatch. At the back of the book, it had his address, where to write to. And so I thought this, and I had seen the guy on TV, and I said, this must be the go-to guy. So I wrote him a letter, never thinking that he would write back. And I got a letter back, and I was just thrilled. And so at the same time, his colleague, also up in Canada, British Columbia, John Green, was writing books. By that time, by, let's just say 1978, he had 4 books out, 3 of them that were booklets, and one was a book, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us, that came out in 1978. But in the booklets, it had his mailing address. And so I said, you know, I think I'll write to this guy and see if he writes back to me. And, you know, I didn't put my age. I didn't put like I was a 15-year-old teenager still in high school, and I just want to know, pick your brain on this and blah, blah, blah. I had I thought about what I would write to him, and to my surprise, he wrote back. And so that's how we became colleagues and friends, and later as I grew older, I went up to Canada multiple times to visit these 2 people. Unfortunately, like Ken said earlier, that Rene somewhat looked at Bigfooting as his lotto ticket, and that it was his opinion, according to John Green, that the best thing to do is not to share this data with other people. We can collect the data, like who's the fellow in Michigan that collects the data, doesn't put it out? Anyway, Phil Shaw knows his name. But so Rene, I guess, kind of had that idea, but John Green, his colleague, kind of felt differently about it. He felt that in order to solve the Bigfoot mystery, because it was starting to make sense that we had a real mystery on our hands, because we have credible witnesses reporting seeing these things cross the road, in the mountains, wherever. And so he felt the best way to do it is to put out as much information as possible to anyone who wants to read about this information. And so that was the genesis of the falling out of those 2 individuals. But by themselves or collectively, they were like, I mean, you could think of them as the Batman and Robin, the Bonnie and Clyde. They were always a team, and then they just seemed to get bigger once they split up and went and did their own things. Green, of course, made a huge name for himself by publishing his books and putting out the data, and towards the end of his life, he put all his data on a database so anyone could have access to it. He died, I think, in May of 2016. And so his daughter, I think as he had 5 children, his oldest daughter had his database website up on the web for a while, but I don't think it's accessible anymore. One thing, I may be jumping around, but I'm hoping that you don't mind, because Ken did bring up multiple times the PG film. And so here's one thing that we should keep in mind, that perhaps when the initial encounter happened with the Patterson-Gimlin PG film in Bluff Creek, California, that maybe Roger and Bob were closer to the subject initially, but they didn't have their camera on it. And so as things started to unfold, naturally, any animal or anything would start, if it's real, is going to start to move away for security, for its own security and survival. And so as this is going on, Roger gets out his camera from the saddlebag. And so according to the estimates that were performed on the film site by John Green and later Rene Dehinden, Green was there first in June of '68, and that was really the only time that he did some real measurements, but that was a good time to do it because the film site is still fresh. Dehinden didn't get there till, I think, 1970. And you got to remember, both of the people at the time were married and had children. Rene Dehinden had 2 kids that he was raising, and John Green had 5 children. And so, you know, you got to juggle things. But Rene got down there later, and John was there earlier. But according to their estimates, John Green put it at about 102 feet. Rene had it at between 90 and 100 feet, based on their calculations of being on the film site.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Thank you all for coming out. It's an honor to be here at this event. Always happy to commune with my fellow Bigfoot enthusiasts around the country. So my name's Ken Gerhard. I'm a cryptozoologist, and my presentation has a little bit of audience participation, so I may ask you to raise your hand from time to time, or just shout out an answer if you think you've got an answer. So how many are you familiar with the term cryptozoologist? Oh, wow. Okay, great. So full admission, I don't have any true scientific credentials. They are not needed to be a cryptozoologist. That said, my father is a scientist. I was raised in a scientific household. I work with the San Antonio Zoo. I do my best to follow scientific methodologies and protocols. And so I'd also like to start with a disclaimer, which is I am not a Bigfoot expert. So what I do is speculation. Thank you, brother. I do speculation with the topic of Bigfoot, and you know, I like to think that I'm a more well-informed speculator. I've been investigating the Bigfoot phenomenon for 45 years, since I was a kid, so I was, you know, definitely well-informed, but I'm going to be speculating today. I encourage people to be objective and to think critically and to question and challenge, and not just always accept everything. You know, we can be respectful about it, but, you know, don't accept everything you hear about Bigfoot. Now, there are many different opinions in the Bigfoot field, okay? This is a highly polarized subject. You're talking about high emotions. You get a lot of different opinions, and I'm always respectful of those different opinions. That said, there is kind of a consensus opinion in the Bigfoot field. If you talk to enough Bigfoot investigators, and I've been very blessed to work with many of the leading Bigfoot investigators around the country, you know, we do have some consensus opinions or things that we generally agree on. So that's kind of the focus of my book, which I'm going to be talking about today. The Essential Guide to Bigfoot is a primer, so it gives you the basic information, the consensus opinion of many Bigfoot investigators. And, you know, we're going to be dealing a little bit with Bigfoot history today, and we're very blessed to have Daniel Perez here, who's a true Bigfoot historian, has been in the field for many decades. But I'm going to be mentioning names like Dr. Grover Krantz. Is everyone familiar with the physical anthropologist Dr. Grover Krantz? And I am in the Bigfoot field, I'm what is considered an aper. Have you guys ever heard of an aper? Okay, there are different kind of opinions or sects. An aper means that I descended, this is a little bit of a metaphor, I descended from the Grover Krantz Jeff Meldrum tree of views on Bigfoot. And I'm good friends with Cliff Barrickman, who we're all kind of considered apers, which means that we think that Bigfoot, if it exists, is basically a hominin or a great ape that looks very similar to us, walks like us. And as a cryptozoologist, I tend to look at this phenomenon through a zoological lens. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm very much about zoology. That's my passion. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about Bigfoot from a zoological perspective, if that makes sense. I'm going to be occasionally quizzing you or asking, someone to shout out an answer, because I think that's fun to have a little bit of audience participation, a little bit of Bigfoot trivia. I do think... Oh, and here we have, the foreword to my book was written by a gentleman named Peter Byrne. Has anyone ever heard of Peter Byrne? He's considered one of the four horsemen of Bigfoot research, which means kind of the old guard researchers that started in the late 1950s. And most of those guys, Peter is still 96 years old, and he wanders around and sets up trail cameras still, so he's quite a treasure. He's up in Oregon. Pretty colorful guy. The four horsemen are Dr. Grover Krantz, John Green. Has everyone heard of John Green? Renee's going to be fortunately covering John Green. Rene Dehinden. Okay, so these are the guys. These guys spent like 40, 50 years investigating Bigfoot. Most of them never had a sighting. Bob Titmus claims to have had a couple of sightings, but Green, Dehinden, Peter Byrne have never had a Bigfoot sighting. I've never had a Bigfoot sighting, so I tell people I'm not 100% convinced it exists. I'm 90% convinced, which is a perfectly scientific way to look at it if you're convinced by the evidence. You got to leave that 10% margin of error because we don't have conclusive evidence yet. So if you're a Bigfoot investigator and you've never had a Bigfoot sighting, don't feel bad, because there were a lot of giants in the Bigfoot field that never had a Bigfoot sighting, and they're very rare in my opinion. Okay, so I tell people I've been investigating Bigfoot since I was 9 years old. And they think, well, 9 years old, are you really a Bigfoot investigator? Well, I wasn't a typical 9-year-old, as you can see by the picture in the upper left-hand corner. When I was 9 years old, I was in the Amazon jungle working with the Yagua tribe, or interacting with the Yagua tribe, the Javaro Indians. My mother was she was a travel agent, and she was very encouraging of my interest in cryptozoology and things like Bigfoot. So she took me all over the world. I've traveled to 26 different countries. Even as a young kid, I was kind of like a little mini Indiana Jones. I kind of fancied myself as an investigator and researcher. When I was 15 years old, I attempted my first field research at Loch Ness in Scotland. So I was 15 years old. I had a movie camera. I was interviewing people and stuff. So this is something I've pursued my whole life. I certainly never planned on making a career out of it. I've just been very blessed and had a lot of opportunities to write books and do television and stuff. So on the lower left-hand corner is a photo of me investigating a Bigfoot-type creature in Central America, in Belize, known as the Sisamito. Did you guys know there were Bigfoot sightings in Central America and Mexico? So apparently Bigfoot does not recognize political delineations. He doesn't stop at the border. He keeps going down wherever you have mountainous ranges. I've also investigated other cryptids. So in the middle upper thing, I'm in Mexico investigating the chupacabra, which you guys have probably heard of, the goat sucker. I co-hosted a series called Missing in Alaska. I don't know if any of you guys have seen that, but on the upper right-hand side there, I'm up there investigating something in Alaska. And in the lower center picture, I'm actually investigating a Sasquatch video that was shot near Squamish, British Columbia in 2012. And if you guys go on YouTube, you'll see there's like over 1 million views. 2 wildlife biologists climbed up to Turkuni Peak, about 7,000 feet up, and they filmed something. They didn't have binoculars, and their camera wasn't very good, so when they blew it up, it's kind of your typical blob squatch, but it does appear to be on 2 legs, and that's what they vouched for. And it would be very strange for a human to be in this particular area walking around, because it's right in the middle of the Garibaldi Range, which I believe was one of Rene Dehinden's favorite research spots as well. So, as I said, I do work with the San Antonio Zoo. I live in San Antonio, Texas. I'm a docent or volunteer educator. I've been there for 7 years. They are actually very accepting of my interest in cryptozoology. I do a lot of classes for kids, tours, and I've done presentations at the zoo. And this is a very large phasmid on my arm there, if you guys are wondering what that bug is. What a lot of people don't know about the San Antonio Zoo is that we sponsored the only expedition ever to search for the Yeti or abominable snowman. Did you guys know this? Back in the 1950s, there was a guy named Tom Slick from San Antonio, Texas. And he was a millionaire, had degrees from MIT, Harvard, Yale. He was a scientist and inventor, and he was very wealthy. And he actually invested money searching for the Yeti. And also he later funded something known as the Pacific Northwest Expeditions, which included all of the greats of Bigfoot research from that time in the late 50s. But Tom Slick and Peter Byrne, who wrote the foreword of my book, was kind of Tom Slick's buddy and was his main investigator in the Yeti expeditions in the late 50s. But the nation of Nepal at that time, before anyone did a Yeti expedition, they required that an official scientific establishment become involved. And wouldn't you know it, Tom Slick just happened to be on the board of directors of the San Antonio Zoo. So it was pretty easy for him to convince the zoo to get behind them. And the skull that I'm posing here with is a Himalayan goat called a Tahr, T-A-H-R. So to make the Yeti expedition a little bit more credible, they listed not only the Yeti as the purpose of the expedition, but also collecting other animals for the San Antonio Zoo. And I asked Peter Byrne, what do you remember about the San Antonio Zoo and your Yeti expeditions sponsored by the zoo? And he said, well, we didn't find a Yeti, but we did collect some snow leopards, he's British, and Himalayan black bears and some Tahrs. So this is an old skull that I found in the zoo's collection, which I believe is one of the mountain goats collected on the Yeti expedition of 1957. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about, again, this is a consensus opinion, guys, and this is just speculation, but, I want to talk about sourcing for a moment. In scientific terms, the sourcing is the data or the evidence that we're looking at. And in terms of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, we actually have at least 6,000 documented Bigfoot and Sasquatch reports dating back to the 1950s and before. And John Green was one of the first Bigfoot investigators that really began compiling a database and putting these sightings together and publishing them in a number of excellent books and pamphlets. Of course, now we have databases online like the BFRO and other Bigfoot groups that we can refer to as well. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is based on the body of evidence, which is these thousands of eyewitness sightings. Now, we can certainly eliminate a percentage of those sightings as possible misidentifications. That does happen. People make mistakes. You might see a bear in poor lighting and think it's a Bigfoot. There are, unfortunately, a lot of people that just make up stories. This is something I encounter a lot in the Bigfoot field, so you have to eliminate some of those as well. But one of the really compelling things about Bigfoot or Sasquatch is that if you look at the thousands of eyewitness accounts, there is a fairly consistent model or description in terms of what people describe in the look, the size, and so forth. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And it's also worth pointing out that John Green, in the 1970s when computers came out, he started thinking, and he was a very forward-thinking guy, and he thought, I should take some of these thousands of eyewitness accounts that I have, some of the best ones, and start putting them into a computer database and see if I can come up with some patterns. Very scientific, right? See if we can figure out some patterns. And so he began in the 70s. I think it may have taken him a couple of decades into the 90s to kind of put this program into place. He used about 1,300 of his best sightings to kind of build an archetype, if you will. And later, a guy named Henner Fahrenbach, who was a wildlife biologist from Oregon, did a similar analytical study using some of John Green's source material, but also adding in other eyewitness accounts. And from those two analytical studies, we were actually able to come up with some pretty cool patterns and statistics. And I'm all about statistics, which is why I dominate my fantasy football league every year. Okay. On the right-hand side here, we have a picture of Patty, as we call her. Raise your hands if you think the Patterson-Gimlin film might be genuine or authentic. And as I said, it's okay to be skeptical or critical thinking. I always encourage that objectivity. So we call her Patty because she appears to have breasts, which is obviously a female characteristic. By the way, this is a red filter that was applied by a researcher named M.K. Davis, who's provided me with a lot of images. And by using this particular filter, maybe it brings out some details and things that you might not see in a regular frame from the film. But that said, if the Patterson-Gimlin film is genuine, then Patty becomes our archetype or our holotype in terms of trying to build a model around what a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch looks like. So Bigfoot is a hominin, which is basically a human-like form, and it's primarily bipedal locomotion, right? It walks on two legs. It utilizes something known as cross-limb coordination, which means that its arm swings alternate with its leg swings. So in that sense, it looks very human-like when it moves, right? There's no other animal in the world that is bipedal and has long arm swings and stuff like that. So I think that's the really startling thing about Bigfoot or Sasquatch that people encounter is it looks very human-like because it moves very much like us. Although there are some subtle differences in terms of its locomotion if you study the Patterson-Gimlin film and read into the eyewitness descriptions. It has a body that is mostly covered in hair, except for the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, and usually eyewitnesses say there's not much hair up here, up on the top of the nose, the bridge of the nose, and under the eyes. It is a uniform hair coloring. Most eyewitnesses describe it as anywhere from 2 to 4 inches in length. And I should point out from a zoological perspective, you do get within any species a bit of genetic diversity, right? In fact, as I look around this room, I see a lot of genetic variation and diversity with different hair colors and features. So you would expect that to some degree within a species of hominin. Bigfoot or Sasquatch has a gigantic stature. This is something that pretty much everybody agrees on. How big do they get is something that we're going to talk about here in a moment, but they are very large compared to us, and that's another startling feature. And by the way, I like to push back against what I call the monsterization of Bigfoot. You know, people like to make Bigfoot into a quote-unquote monster. It is big and scary because it's big and it looks like us and it has some scary features. But I think there's kind of a cultural tendency for people to want to make Bigfoot a quote-unquote monster, you know. And I view it as more of an undiscovered animal. That's kind of where I'm coming from. Now, certainly any animal can be dangerous, you know, bears, mountain lions, a squirrel could really mess you up if you pissed it off, right? So you have to respect nature and animals. But I am not of the position that Bigfoot is out to get us. I don't think it's making people disappear in the national parks. I don't think it's ripping people from limb to limb. I think if it did have that disposition, then we would sure know it existed by now. But that said, there are also behavioral variations in the animal kingdom. So you could theoretically, just like with a bear that has a more of an aggressive attitude or whatever, same might apply to Bigfoot or Sasquatch, where you have some that are a little bit more territorial, aggressive, and so on and so forth. Virtually every Bigfoot eyewitnesses describes very broad shoulders, usually about 3 feet across, and no visible neck, which is actually interpretation because when we say there's no neck, what we really mean is that it has very powerful trapezius muscles that connect and it has to do with its jaws and its mastication, its chewing. So it is very powerful in the upper body, barrel torso, you know, big and powerful all over, really. But it appears to have no neck, or the head seems to sit on top of the neck because it's very powerful up in this region. Again, these are very consistent things that many eyewitnesses describe. The arms appear proportionally longer compared to a human. Now, this is something called the intermembral index within the field of hominins and great apes. Humans have a shorter intermembral index because our arms are relatively short compared to the length of our legs because we're upright bipedal walkers. Other great apes like gorillas and orangutans specifically, and gibbons, because they're brachiators, they're arboreal and they swing through trees, their arms are much longer than their legs. Sasquatch seems to have an intermembral index in between those other great apes and humans. So most Bigfoot eyewitnesses describe the arms as hanging very low, almost down to the knees, which is one of the things that really irks me when I see all of these like Bigfoot statues and cutouts around, because they always make the arms really short, and I'm always like, make those arms are long, you know, maybe not down to the knees, but they're definitely longer than a human's. Okay, so how big does Bigfoot really get? And this is all well-informed speculation is what I'm going on here. And I'm going to apply a little bit of zoological principle here in terms of what makes sense. Because zoology is all about animal adaptation. Animals adapt to their environment over a long period of time, and all of those adaptations are geared towards survival. So they make sense. Does anyone want to guess? Daniel, sit back on this one, please. You can shout. How tall is Patty in the Patterson-Gimlin film? Anybody? It's good. I'm hearing a lot of 7 foot. Anyone have another guess? Okay, so now these estimates are based on, there have been some academic studies done on the film by guys like Dr. Grover Krantz, Donald Glickman, who was a forensic film analyst that looked at the film early on, and other people. John Green did a recreation shortly after the film was made with a guy named Jim McLaren. Guys have gone out to the site back in the day, and they measured things, and they had people standing next to measuring tapes. There were some things seen in the film. In fact, I got to finally visit the film site last year, and sure enough, some of those old trees are there, and you can line them up and say, wow, that tree's still there, and that's that. And so based on that, and also the length of Patty's foot, and you guys, I'm sure you know there was a trackway left behind by Patty, which is another layer of evidence. And Daniel's going to do a presentation on the film a little later today, so we'll get more in depth on that. But we know that Patty's footprints were about 14.5 inches long. And so multiplying that, dividing that by 7 foot 3 inches. And by the way, 7 foot 3 is the conclusion that was drawn by Glickman, Bill Munns, Daniel Perez, John Kirk, Chris Murphy, myself. Most people are on the consensus 7 foot 3, but there is some difference. Grover Krantz thought it might be Patty might be a little shorter, like maybe 6'6". John Green started out in the 7 foot 3 inch camp, and then once he did his recreation, he came down a little bit. Cliff Barrickman thinks it's more like 6'5", so that we have a range or an estimate. But the real significance of 7 foot 3 inches tall is that, if you guys didn't know this, there are only 3,000 people in the world right now that are over 7 feet tall. It's an incredibly rare for someone to get that tall. And back in 1967, it was probably half that, right? So if it was, quote unquote, a man in a costume, where did Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin find someone 7 foot 3 inches tall to put on this alleged costume? So that's one of the arguments for the validity of the film. So we think 7 foot 3. The consensus, that is the consensus opinion, but there's going to be a little bit of variation in opinion from different researchers. Most hominoids, and I'm sorry if these terms are interchangeable, hominoid includes orangutans in the great ape family. Hominin, if I say that, basically means humans, chimps, gorillas, excluding orangutans, because there's it's all about taxonomy and how animals are classified. Hominoids, great apes, are sexually dimorphic. What that means is that the male and female within a species have different physical characteristics. And in terms of hominoids and hominins, us, males, are bigger, correct? I mean, this is a general thing. In the terms of gorillas and orangutans, the males can be almost twice as big as the females. If you talk about a big 450-pound silverback male compared to a smaller female. In most hominoids, it's about 15%. Males are about at least 15% larger. So then we can speculate if we know Patty was a female and she was 7 foot 3 inches tall, then theoretically a male would be bigger, right? Does that make sense? So does anyone want to guess, how tall do you think Bigfoot could actually get? 16 feet? Wow, okay. Anyone else? 9 foot? Daniel, do you want to? No? Okay. This is my opinion. Again, I'm not trying to be contentious with anyone. In my opinion, Bigfoot or Sasquatch can get to be about 9 feet tall. And we have to remember that people, when they encounter these things, it's a heightened state of emotion. You're anxious, you're nervous. Sometimes these encounters are only a few seconds long, so it's just an estimate. That's all it is. In my book, I talk about how I've gotten to meet a few famous basketball players, like the Postman, Karl Malone, Akeem Olajuwon. When you stand next to these guys, I can't estimate how tall they are. I mean, they get to be 9 feet tall. I mean, basically they are towering humans, and that's at close range. So people guess how big they are. Now, again, there is genetic variation. So if they can get to be about 9 feet tall, you might have like gigantism. We have this in humans, where occasionally there are humans and other animals that are exceptionally large. So theoretically, you might have a 10-foot. I don't really advocate the existence of 12, 14, 15, 16-foot tall Sasquatches. And part of that is because adaptation. Because although large size can be a benefit in terms of survival, there is a threshold where it then becomes a disadvantage, right? I mean, if something is 16 feet tall and it's walking around here in Michigan, is it bumping its head on branches and trying to get under things and stuff? So, but you might have an exceptional giant individual. By the way, this picture is, I was at a Bigfoot exhibit in San Antonio, my hometown, in 2006, and they actually had a vote yes, vote no after you left the exhibit, whether you thought Bigfoot might exist or not. So that was kind of fun. And if you guys didn't know this, there are at least a couple of recent surveys that indicate that only 18% of the general population thinks Bigfoot might exist. So we are the minority here. If you guys think Bigfoot might exist, we're basically 1 out of 5 people. I'm sure you get a lot of ridicule and ribbing from your friends and stuff. Now, I always like to point out, this doesn't mean that everybody loves Bigfoot, right? We love Bigfoot in movies, commercials. It's become an important cultural icon in our society. So everybody loves the idea of Bigfoot, but only about 18% of us think that, yeah, I think it probably could exist. So, okay, so let's talk about estimated weights. And this is based on the heights that we just discussed. Now, Dr. Grover Krantz, who was a physical anthropologist, studied the Patterson-Gimlin film at length. And based on his estimate, and he thought she was about 6'5", 6'6", combining that with the body mass and muscle ratios of other great apes like gorillas and orangutans, he estimated that Patty weighed about 543 pounds, something in that area. It was just an educated guess, but a scientific guess based on, different variables. And if they get to be up to be 8 or 9 feet tall, then it's fair to presume they might weigh as much as 1,000 pounds. So I think a large male probably weighs between 800 to 1,000 pounds. Females might be a little bit lighter, 500, 600, 700 pounds. They're big, heavy animals, right? And this is also borne out by the depth of the footprints that have been found, because they, obviously people that find the footprints say it's very deep in the ground. Okay, so other features. What color is Bigfoot? Good answer. Gray? Black? Blue? No. Okay, so again, this is based on the analytical studies by John Green and Henner Fehrenbach. They found that about 55% of Bigfoot eyewitnesses describe the color as black or dark. Some of this might have to do with poor lighting. About 30% of eyewitnesses describe various shades of brown, including light brown, dark brown, reddish brown. And only about 15% of eyewitnesses describe Bigfoots that either have like a blonde, white, gray, or an alternate color. And we do have sightings that bear this out. And again, genetic variation, guys. This is actually good evidence for the existence of Bigfoot, in my opinion, because it shows that there is potentially a viable species out there that displays a natural range of genetic variation. Just like with black bears. Most black bears are black, but you also have cinnamon Kermode bears, spirit bears, and there are different genetic groupings where you have bears that have different colors. What do their faces look like? Okay, this is definitely the most subjective aspect of the Bigfoot mystery. Because, let's face it, most people when they see these things, they only see it for a brief amount of time, for obvious reasons. They want to get the heck out of there. Bigfoot seem to be spending a lot of time peeking out from behind trees, peeking in windows. They move away quickly from us, typically. So we don't get a lot of good daylight Class A sightings, as they're called. But the people that have had those sightings either describe it as having as looking like a very ape-like human, or a very human-like ape. So what we can say is scientifically is that it's a mosaic, a combination of man and ape-like features, which puts it somewhere in our family tree of hominins. Do their eyes glow in the dark? They do? Okay, we need a distinction here. There are actually a lot of accounts and people describe the eyes glow in the dark. Now, there is no precedent in the animal kingdom for self-illuminating eyes. So there's nothing that as eyes can light up like a flashlight. So I think that's a little bit of a misrepresentation. I think it would be fair to say their eyes may reflect light, right? Just like you guys, the deer in the headlights, you shine your flashlight at a dog or another animal, sometimes you get a little bit of that reflection back. Now, one of the great red herrings in the Bigfoot field, which is kind of ironic because red herring describes red eye glow or reflection, which is, I guess, potentially possible depending on certain angles of light and the source of the light and other variables. But most animals that have eyes that reflect in the dark are nocturnal species that have adapted to that condition, and they have something called a tapetum lucidum, which is basically an ocular membrane on the eye, And the purpose of that ocular membrane is to gather as much light as possible in a low light environment and help them see better at night. And one of the residual effects of this tapetum lucidum is that the eye will reflect when you shine light on it. So, as I said, I've never seen a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. I may have seen eye shine one time. We heard some vocalizations. We moved to a higher vantage point. This was back in 2003. And we had a spotlight that we shined down where we just heard this thing. And we did see some eye reflection. I can't say definitively it was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, but based on the vocalizations that we heard and recorded, it could have been. And the eye shine that we got was a greenish yellow color, which is pretty much what most animals in the animal kingdom have. So again, one of the things I like to do in terms of my book and my presentations is kind of respectfully push back against a lot of the misinformation that's out there. And unfortunately, one of the failings of this great world we live in with this social media and instant communication is there's just a ton of bad information out there about Bigfoot on different podcasts and things, and people just make things up or kind of take things they like and run with them. So, did you have a question?
When we all get a picture taken, our eyes are red, and get the red out.
Uh-huh.
What would be that cause?
Well, I think that's an artifact of the camera mechanism itself. I'm not a photographer per se, but I think that might have to be something, because that does seem to be a pretty common thing, which is why cameras have that eye glow filter. But perhaps the level of light that's being produced by the camera flash or whatever is an unnatural amount of light, whereas opposed to... Yeah. Now that said, I do know people that have told me that they've shined a light in their dog's eyes at a certain angle and it looks kind of reddish. So it is possible that maybe under certain conditions you might get a little bit of a hint of a reddish color and stuff. But the percentage of people that describe red eye shine is a little bit, it doesn't make sense in terms of zoology. Not saying it's not possible, because animals do adapt and have different things. But that is a great question. Thank you for that. Okay, does Bigfoot smell bad? Great answer. Sometimes they do. But one of the things that we do to monsterize Bigfoot is that Bigfoot always smells bad. Now, when it smells bad, it smells really bad, right? People have described the stench as something like something dead, feces, a skunk, garbage, a combination of all those things. There are some obvious reasons why Bigfoot might smell bad. One would be hygiene. I'm pretty sure Bigfoot doesn't use any type of body wash. It lives out in damp environments. It might eat dead things from time to time. So there are reasons that it might smell bad. But you'd probably be surprised to learn that based on our analytical study of Bigfoot, thousands of Bigfoot sightings by Henner Fehrenbach and John Green, really the bad smell is only described about 5 to 14% of the time in Bigfoot sightings. So it's a very small amount of time. It's just one of those things that we kind of latch onto because it makes it scarier. Ooh, it smells bad too. By the way, there's one state in the United States where you have a higher percentage of bad smells reported, 14%. Can anyone guess what state that might be? Florida, the skunk ape. More people. And Florida is a lot of swamps and things and dampness and stuff, so that makes sense. By the way, now that I kind of forget things and I come back and visit them, you guys should be very proud here in Michigan, because based on the number of eyewitness sightings that have been documented, I think Michigan is about 7th or 8th in terms of sightings. We've got Washington, California, Oregon, then Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And I think Michigan might be like up there, number 7. And my beloved Texas is in the top 10 too. So we do have a long historical account and a number of Bigfoot sightings and accounts that have been documented here through the years. Okay, now we're going to talk about the foot morphology and a little bit of history here. This gentleman on the right-hand side is named Jerry Crew. If you guys probably should be familiar with this story. Mr. Jerry Crew, and by the way, I'm friends with one of his great nephews, a guy named Carl Crew, who's a really interesting guy and is producing a documentary about Jerry Crew's life right now. So he's got access to all the family members and stuff. But Jerry Crew, in 1958, in August of 1958, he was the cat skinner or bulldozer operator on a logging road in Bluff Creek, California. He would show up to work in the morning and find giant human-like footprints around his bulldozer, and he first thought he was being pranked. And then finally he went to a friend, a guy named Bob Titmus, who is a taxidermist, and Bob told him, Well, here, gave him some plaster and said, why don't you make a cast of that footprint, and then we can study it better. So Bob Titmus is the guy that came up with this idea to cast it. His buddy Jerry Crew did cast this footprint, took it into a newspaper office or one of them in October of 1958. It was October 4th, and spoke to the newspaper editor of the Humboldt Times, a guy named Andrew Gonzoli, who took a picture of it, and the name Bigfoot appeared for the very first time in a newspaper article, and it went viral around the world. And that's kind of where the name Bigfoot has kind of come from. Before that, of course, it was Sasquatch in Canada, or they were wild men, bushmen, big hairy apes. There were a number of names that Bigfoot was called before 1958. Okay, so now this is a trick question. When was the very first Bigfoot print cast? 1941. Have you guys ever heard of something called the Ruby Creek Incident? This occurred in British Columbia on the Fraser River. It's a very famous story in Bigfoot literature where the Jeannie Chapman and her 3 kids got scared out of their cabin by a Bigfoot, or a Sasquatch, as they'd call it up there, coming out of the woods toward them. Scared them out of the cabin. They ran away. Eventually, they came back with George Chapman and the husband and other railroad workers that he worked with. And very few people know this, but there was actually a Bigfoot researcher in Bellingham, Washington back in 1941 named Sheriff Joe Dunn. And he heard about the Ruby Creek incident, drove up there, brought some plaster, and made a cast of one of these giant 16-inch footprints that were on their property, smashing their potato plants. And supposedly this thing tore open a barrel of salted salmon and stuff. But so he made a cast of this footprint, and John Green, Mr. Sasquatch, when he started becoming interested in the Sasquatch phenomenon in like 1956, 57, he made a tracing of this, or no, he was shown a tracing. There was a guy named S.E. Tifting, who was there in the local, who had made a tracing on paper of this foot cast. Unfortunately, Sheriff Joe Dunn ended up using this Sasquatch print from 1941 as a doorstop in his house, and his kids played with it, and it was destroyed. So it's very unfortunate we don't have that original Sasquatch print. But what's significant about that is when John Green, Mr. Sasquatch, had this tracing of this footprint, when he traveled down to Bluff Creek, California in 1958, shortly after Jerry Crew and others began seeing, Bob Titmus and others began finding these footprints, he actually saw some fairly fresh big footprints in the ground. And wouldn't you know it, it looked almost identical to the tracing from Ruby Creek in 1941. So even though it seems pretty obvious to us, this was the very first time when we could say automatically, okay, Sasquatch and Bigfoot are the same species, it seems. So, all right. This is a great trivia question if you guys ever want to. How big are Bigfoot footprints on average? Does anyone know this? This is, again, based on these analytical studies of eyewitness observations and documentation of Bigfoot Sasquatch tracks. There have been thousands of these found. Boy, if I had a prize, you might be getting it. I don't have prizes, but it always feels good to be the smartest one in the room for a few seconds, doesn't it? I always enjoy that feeling, so kudos to you. Okay, the average Bigfoot or Sasquatch track is 15.5 inches long by 7.2 inches wide. And if you think about it in terms of how wide it is, it's much wider than a human footprint, right, in relation to the length. So that is one of the markers that we've found consistently throughout Bigfoot Sasquatch tracks, is they're very broad. They don't have an arch, right, because they're bigger and heavier, so the arch has collapsed. The toes are more uniform in size compared to ours, so they do have a big toe, but it's a little bit smaller compared to the other toes. And, you know, you guys have probably heard Dr. Jeff Meldrum on TV or maybe at this presentation. He and Cliff Barrickman are kind of the two guys that are really immersed in the footprint morphology. My personal, and I've studied not only my own observations, talking to other investigators, but, you know, going through Bigfoot literature and reading thousands of accounts, the largest accepted length for a track, in my opinion, is 18 inches. Now, we have to recognize that when a foot leaves a track in the ground, there are a lot of variables, like the substrate. Is it muddy? Is it snow? Will it melt? So even if you had an 18-inch foot, you could potentially leave a track that was a little bigger, you know, based on how you stepped in the ground, the speed, and the trajectory. But 18 inches seems to be the cap to me, and that actually would equate to our 9-foot male Sasquatch. Based on Patty's footprints, and we know if we assume she's 7 foot 3 inches tall or 87 inches tall, divided by 14.5 is a ratio of 1 to 6. So for most of you people, even though there's some genetic variation, your foot is probably about 1/6 the length of your height. So if there's an 18-inch track, that would be our big 9-foot Sasquatch. Now, by the way, this is, again, compelling evidence, because if Patty's footprint was 14.5 inches, then, again, it would make sense that a female footprint is a little bit smaller. And I think Phil did a good job earlier when he was showing different size tracks that have been found around here of saying, okay, this one's only 15. Maybe it's a female because it's a little smaller. But yeah, if anyone ever comes in, I've had people do this where they bring in like a 24-inch Bigfoot track. Look at this guy. And I'm like, no. That would be a 12 or 15-foot Bigfoot. That just doesn't make sense to me. So that's a good way to be skeptical if anyone ever tries to show you a huge footprint like that. Okay, here's an interesting, there are certain ecological questions. If Bigfoot is an undiscovered species, which I think it is, we have to answer, there are certain ecological questions that have to be answered because every animal requires food sources, water, shelter. They have breeding patterns and different behavior patterns. So this is pure speculation, guys, but this is my opinion. How many Bigfoots or Sasquatches are populating the entire continent of North America? Not bad. Did you say 5? I feel like an auctioneer. Can I have 5, 6, 6, 6, 7? 6? Okay. So Dr. Grover Krantz, the physical anthropologist, was one time asked, well, how many of these things are out there running around? There's not just one, right? You guys, occasionally I get that oddball question about, like, there's one Bigfoot. Well, how old is this Bigfoot? You know, it's like, well, he gets around too. So Dr. Grover Krantz was once asked, well, how many of these things are out there, do you think? And he said 4,000. His rationale was if there were any more than 4,000, we would have more evidence that they existed, or definitive evidence. If there were less than 4,000, they would probably go extinct. So that was back, maybe in the 70s and 80s when he speculated about that. So I was riding with, I was at an event with Dr. Jeff Meldrum a few years ago, and I asked him, I said, well, Dr. Jeff, how many Bigfoot, Sasquatches do you think there are in North America? And he actually said, well, he can identify different footprints and equate them to certain individuals because he's gotten that knowledgeable about looking at Bigfoot and Sasquatch tracks. And Jeff said, well, I know of one particular male individual, and I've found his footprints in different locations and different time periods about 75 miles apart. So based on that, I estimate, and also using the range of gorillas and orangutans and other great apes, that they probably have a roaming range of about 1,000 square miles. Well, that sounds like a lot, but what we're actually talking about is 50 miles this way, 50 that way, right? So something like that, 75, So Jeff went on to say, well, based on that, I would estimate there are about 75 Sasquatches in my home state of Idaho. So I thought about that, and then I took his figure, or his estimation, and I multiplied that by the amount of wilderness area in North America, not including cities and suburbs and developed areas, just the vast wilderness of North America. Guess what number I came up with? 4,000. So it's just a guess, guys, but it is an educated guess because it's, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. Now, working with the San Antonio Zoo, and I'm very proud to say that my zoo is very active in terms of working in conservation and breeding endangered species. We actually saved the whooping crane from extinction in 1956. We breed a lot of critically endangered animals at the San Antonio Zoo. And one thing I've learned about animal conservation is that once you get below a threshold of about 1,000 to 1,500 individuals of any species, it's basically critically endangered. And what that means primarily is that there's not enough genetic variability for that species to continue. For any species to proliferate over a long time, there has to be genetic variation within that species, or else you get genetic bottlenecks and things go extinct. So I would say that there have to be at least 1,000 to 1,500 Bigfoots or Sasquatches in North America, and at that rate, they are critically endangered, and probably more like a few thousand. So you guys, I'm giving you guys hopefully a little ammunition to use when your skeptical buddies at work around the water cooler come up to you and say, come on, man, Bigfoot, how many of these things are there? And you can explain to them, well, there's got to be at least a few thousand. But again, that's spread all over the continent of North America, from Alaska to Florida to California. Now, if there are a few thousand Sasquatches or Bigfoots all over the continent of North America, it is incredibly rare. It is an incredibly rare animal, guys. And this is one of the things that we talk about in terms of why haven't we found remains? Because it's a really super rare animal. So I'm personally skeptical when I meet people that tell me, I've got a clan of 12 Bigfoots on my property out here on these 5 acres or whatever. And I think, well, that just doesn't make sense because they're spread out. But again, they would go extinct if the threshold goes too low. What does Bigfoot eat? This is a question I like to ask kids at the zoo when I'm doing interpreting the bear exhibit. Very good. That's it. The answer really is anything. Bigfoot, in my opinion, is a generalist omnivore, exactly like a bear. It eats, Phil talked about this earlier. There are accounts of it eating meat, salmon, deer, small mammals. It eats berries, vegetation, tubers, carrion. People say sometimes they raid garbage cans. So it's just like a bear in terms of its diet, which makes perfect zoological sense in terms of if you're talking about a mammal that weighs several hundred pounds, that has a high metabolism, it's going to spend most of its waking hours searching for food and foraging and eating whatever it can. It has to, if it's that big and it's on the move. So an interesting tie-in here is that I've found that wherever you have a substantial amount of Bigfoot sightings and accounts, you also have a healthy bear population. And it makes perfect sense because I think Bigfoot or Sasquatch has adapted a very similar ecological niche to bears. And they probably are in some competition, but they may have worked out some kind of understanding. For example, Bigfoot or Sasquatch we think may be primarily nocturnal for the most part. Bears can be crepuscular, so they're up at dusk and dawn. Brown bears are typically diurnal. So, maybe the bears, they are in competition, but they probably work around each other. But the bears are much more prevalent. So if there are about 4,000 Bigfoots, Sasquatches in North America, there are an estimated 600,000 black bears in North America. So there's probably about 120 black bears to every Sasquatch. So again, you guys, I know you guys occasionally see bears up here in Michigan. You're probably 120 times more likely to see a bear than a Bigfoot.
All right, well, my name is Chuck Vigneault, and all I can tell you, my stories have gone back from when, I'm a big hunter. I'm always deep in the woods. And so, I got to thinking about all the times the strange things that's happened to me, and they would register. And I'm just saying over the last 25 years, a few weird things would happen. So I'm just going to tell you about the weird stuff that I saw. So my company said, hey, you got to use your vacation, you're going to lose it. And we used to be able to carry, months of vacation. So I said, all right, well, I'm going to take a month off and we're going to go hunting. So me and a buddy, we went up to Brevoort. That's up, up north, by Brevoort between St. Ignace and yeah, okay. So Brevoort is right up in this area. Right there's Brevoort. That might be Brevoort Lake right there. So anyway, there's a lot of truck trails there that, you can go out in the woods for miles and miles and miles, and that's what we did. We hauled a trailer out there, and then we had a couple of ATVs, and so we had 2 weeks of bow hunting and then 2 weeks of gun hunting. And we set up all our stuff, and we were out there, and we were coming back to get there with the ATVs. We went by this swamp that was just gigantic. I mean, you can figure cattails 6-7 foot tall, and, as far as you could see, it wasn't a place we were going to hunt, but we went right by it in our ATVs every day. So we were coming back, and we saw something walking across the swamp. And, I mean, it was this far over the cattails. And, we never thought of Bigfoot, never really, we might have saw the movie when we were kids, but we never really ever thought about it. That thing was walking across that thing, and we said it was either a moose or a Bigfoot. It was so big. It wasn't running, and we watched it for a few minutes as it walked across the edge of the swamp, and it was a long ways, hundreds and hundreds of yards. We didn't have any of our gear. We left it at the stands. We just come in and get something to eat. And so we didn't have binoculars to look at it or anything. So that was like my first experience that I had to kind of think back of what were kind of odd things that I had no explanation. So then, that was about 25 years ago. And then about 10 years ago, we had a cabin up around Gladwin, and it was just a hunting cabin, and we always hunted state land. And I don't know if anybody has heard this Midland to Mackinac Trail. It runs through the swamps. It starts, right here in Midland, and then it goes all the way up. And it's a trail through the swamps that you can walk, and sometimes it's on private land, sometimes it's public, but you can go through that. And it was, later in the season, and we weren't seeing nothing, and I said, let's just take a walk down this trail. So we walked probably a good 3 or 4 hours into that trail, and we were in the middle of nowhere. And all these things happen when in places where there ain't nothing around. So all of a sudden we were walking there, and the woods got super quiet. And I looked at my son. We were, not far from each other. And it was a really strange, weird feeling. Everything was quiet. It almost felt like it got darker. And I took another step. And then we started to kind of smell. I did. I started to smell something. And I smell that. And I smell it. And all of a sudden, a deer jumped out in front. I mean, like this far from me. Now, it was laying down, and deer won't never do that. I mean, if you're walking, and a deer is not going to lay down unless it's hurt and it wants to get away. This thing was hiding, and it was hiding from something. And when we smelled that, and it jumped up and it took off running, oh my gosh, Dad, you smelled that deer before it, and I goes, well, I don't know if that's what it was, but it was just a weird feeling. So, the first time I thought I saw one. Second time, I think I smelled one. And then, now as I got older, I'm not out in the woods as much as I used to be, but, I want to do, I got into more of the Bigfoot thing and thinking about it and all that. So I had this Jeep, and I kind of set it up with, a couple Bigfoot stickers on it. And we always camp a lot of times up in, Oscoda on the Asabo River. So me and my son and 2 of his friends, we just head out in the woods, and we're driving that Jeep wherever we can, out in this old logging trail. And we came up on the Asabo, and I mean, it was way down in there, and they wanted to jump in, so the kids got down and they jumped in, and they got back up, and we drove back. But it was a beautiful scenery. So the next, we go back, and I tell my wife, and we got our grandkids there, and oh, come on, Papa, let's go up there and see it. All right, so I get, my wife and a couple of our grandkids, and we take this trail back up there, and we get to the top of this ridge, and there's the water, and at the time I'm going to do a Bigfoot call. So I did a Bigfoot call, and down at the bottom of the water and around the corner, a big yell back at me, and I thought, probably nobody walking through this woods way out here in the middle of nowhere. And so, the little ones would get scared a little bit. So I, did a 3-pointer and turned the Jeep around and head back down. And I'm going to do one more just for the fun of it. And so I did another one. And that call had come around that corner, which, we're talking hundreds of yards. And, matter of seconds or minutes. I don't know what it was. But when he yelled that much closer to me, the kids just, oh, Bubba, we got to go. So, I kind of waited around a little bit, and, they were screaming at me. So I put it in drive and took off. So, that was kind of my 3 experiences over my course of my lifetime. And they were always out in the middle of nowhere. And, yeah.
Wasn't that last one near?
Yeah, the last one was, I didn't show. That would have been up in, Oscoda, right up around the foot dam. And, the ponds and stuff up there, So now, I'm a true believer, because my research, a little bit of the research, I'm not like these guys, but I like to watch the shows and read on it. And what really convinced me is how can so many societies over so many courses of hundreds and thousands of years have the same stories? The same stories. And that's really was, okay, I can understand now, Bigfoot, you got the internet, everybody can talk about it and everybody can talk. But what about 1,000 years ago, even 200 years ago? There was no possibility of that kind of cooperation. But yet they still were out there. So that's all I got.
Hey everybody, I'm George. I live about 18 miles, I guess, to the almost directly east of here over in Prescott. And got an 80-acre hunting camp, it's been in our family about 35 years. And I decided about 3 years ago, I was going to move up there and homestead it. Never had power, just outhouse and the big hunting shack kind of barn thing. And so the place has kind of been vacant, 9 months out of the year, except for when my dad and his buddies and our family and stuff are there bow hunting and whatnot. But nobody's ever really lived there during the summer, so I've had a ton of experiences there. I guess I'll just to make it brief, I'll go with the first one and the last one. So first one that kind of I wasn't really a full-on Sasquatch believer or anything. I had, seen some curious things in the woods and listened to stories and whatnot. I wasn't a disbeliever in any way, but it wasn't really on my radar. Wasn't something I was really thinking about too often. But one night when I initially moved to our property, which was the summer of 2019, I would say it was like beginning of August or something, and I had been kind of prepping myself knowing that the weather's going to change, it's going to start getting cooler, and I got to start thinking about, am I wintering in the barn? And I just had been huddling around this campfire that I just kind of made like my hangout area, and we never really had fires there. It's a bow hunting camp, and my dad's a real purist. Like no one slams car doors or anything. It's like you do the click and butt bump kind of thing, and everybody's really, and everybody's from downstate, Flatlanders, idiots, whatever you want to call them. So I had to kind of pay my dues to not be called one of those for a little while. But I was sitting by the fire one evening, and it was just kind of one of those real starry nights, and I hear this kind of low, like a cow kind of sound, like a as about as good as I can get, but it was real deep and textural, like a cow, and it was off maybe a couple hundred yards to one side of me, and I'm kind of trying to think of where the farms are close by, and there's nobody that has cattle right where I'm at, and I'm just outside the village of Prescott, and we're kind of up on a hill, so I can hear sounds through some of these kind of terrain features pretty good. And it was off in this big 4 or 5 hay fields that there's just never anything in. I kind of hear this, whoa, and I'm like, what's that? And then off, say that was at my 10 o'clock, off about my 1 o'clock, maybe 100 yards in, I hear another different toned one, kind of boom, and I was like, oh, kind of racing through my mind, like somebody's cows got out, or, it's maybe, I had a couple beers, I was sitting up, it was maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, so I start running through my mind of like, oh, what could that be? And then the first one goes back again, and I realized there was like a call and response kind of thing happening and moving towards me. It was getting closer, and then a third one chimed in much closer, within like, I would just estimate like 50, 75 yards, meters or so. And I was like, okay, time to go in, and we've got a big barn that I can button up, and I got freaked out, but I still hadn't really put, Sasquatch in my mind yet. I was just running through loose cows, like, man, do we have a feral hog problem? What could this be? What could this be? And so I went in the upstairs, and we have a sliding door balcony kind of thing, and I was tiptoeing and creeping, all lights out, and I got my guns out, and I laid out on the balcony, and I got a pretty high-powered assault rifle and a 30-30, and then my little pea shooter pistol, and I'm laying there, and I'm like looking out at our kind of pasture area, and then there's these really thick pines, and kind of those sounds are coming right at me, moving, and and the thought popped into my head, man, could that be Bigfoot? Like, if it is, it's multiple. And then the next thought was, I was gonna see something come out of the woods. I just had this feeling someone's gonna walk right out, and the thought popped into my head: are you gonna shoot it? Would you shoot it? Would you shoot if you saw the mythical thing? And I told myself no, and I had put my phone up and hit video record, and I do have audio somewhere in iCloud I took a long video. It's just a blackness, and it's got the last maybe 2 minutes of these sounds kind of moving. So that was, not the most exciting story, but that's kind of what kicked off this kind of flurry of activity over the next 3 years. Anything from, seeing kind of like impressions in the soft moss that look, nothing like super definitive, like, man, that looks like a footprint, but 1,000 things can when you're in the woods long enough. And we have our back 40 is primarily swamp, and it's the bedding area for deer. It's really prime bow hunting kind of area, and it's rare to go down in that area. So over those years, when there's not a lot of people around, I was having, some audio experiences. One night I had something go moo, like someone was imitating a cow over here. And then about 5 minutes later, I'm like, man, that was somebody just going moo. And then in the middle, kind of where those 3 sounds came from the first time, something went cock-a-doodle-doo, just like Looney Tunes, like the, Bugs Bunny or something. And I'm like, okay, I had problems with some locals just making fun of me because they saw a Bigfoot sticker on my water bottle, and I spent a lot of time discerning between my mental state, people pranking me, what I'm really hearing. And then the third one off to the right flank, I'll call it, goes, ow, 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 like imitating a coyote. And I was like, haha, that was the 3 sounds I got. And it was humorous. There was no kind of threat to it or anything, but so fast forward to the last experience. Now this was I would say late July, early August of last year, 2021, right in the height of like mosquito season. It's just hot and sticky. And one of my old hippie friends had told me, long ago in a conversation, they were like, man, if you ever have a Sasquatch experience, leave them garlic cloves. They'll love you forever. Like, if you're in the swamp, like, leave them garlic cloves. And it just stuck in my mind, and I was always forgetting when I was at the store. And then one day I was just like, man, I don't know, what could it hurt? Like, keep things away. I need some garlic in my life, whatever. So I bought these garlic cloves, and I had kind of just had them stinking up my pockets and stuff for a while. And I had some trail cams I had to move out in the swamp, and had a big predator problem with coyotes, and I'm very protective of like my little birds and rabbits and stuff like that. I love the small game, and the predator stuff. I just kind of like, I had some predator hunters just kind of really pushing their way onto our property, and I was like, I don't want to take care of my own predator problem, so I kind of reset some of my trail cams in areas that were low that I thought, I might see if there's coyote, bobcat coming through that area. I was all setting these cameras, and I put one in, and I had this pocket full of garlic cloves, and I had accepted, I've got proof enough from these last couple of years that this is a reality of my life and these beings are real, and I just kind of like come to the conclusion I really don't want to get a visual because I'm pretty far back by myself, and I feel like our understanding of a comfortable distance is good enough for me. And when I go back into the swamp alone in the dark, I don't know if anybody else will do it. I'm just one of the ones dumb enough. It's always the feeling of like I'm being escorted or something. And so it was getting kind of dark. It was when the days are really long, so it was probably like 8:30. And I was getting kind of nervous, and I set this last trail camera, and the squirrels were going just berserk around me. And I was like, well, so much for being stealthy, it's like, call it Squirrel War 3. They're just chattering, and, I'm like, okay, guys, I'm here, you got me. And I'm like, damn, squirrels. And the squirrels have just been giving me hell all summer, red squirrels in my barn. And I came back onto our main trail, and I stepped onto the trail, and the squirrel chatter just stopped. And everything got really kind of silent. And I had like 3 or 4 cloves of garlic left, and into the main body, the thickest part of the swamp where no one really goes. I kind of set a couple cloves of garlic out and just kind of made a statement like, hey, these are gifts. Thanks for letting me, just sound like a crazy person in the woods talking to myself and saying things out loud because through all the research, I'm just kind of figuring like if things do mind speak, that's nothing I really want to experience, so we'll just talk out loud. And I got enough voices in my head, I don't need another one. Yeah, I would be able to figure out which was which at that point. They probably know that already. But so everything kind of goes silent, and I'm like, it didn't really strike me as like that. I've listened to a lot of stories and that silence that people talk about where just the woods goes dead and the kind of the fear projection. I didn't really have that, but I was like, oh man, cool. The squirrels stopped chattering, it was just striking that they weren't chattering anymore. And I found myself in this area that I had been a bunch of times, but it looked different. It was getting twilight, kind of this humid fog over the swamp, and just mosquitoes everywhere. And I'm like, okay, I gotta leave these garlic pieces. And then I hear this thump behind me. I took a couple steps, and I turned back over my shoulder, and there was like cleanly ripped in half red squirrel, and just the back legs, its tail, and its abdomen, like guts hanging out. And I'm like, all right, did a bird, I'm looking up, like, did an eagle drop it? I was just going through my mind of all these things, and I was like, oh man, something fast enough to snatch a red squirrel fresh, and it felt like they just went, hey, squirrel's bothering you? Look at this. And I was like,
Or thanks for the garlic.
Possibly, yeah. It was kind of like, and just this, like, feeling of, I'm always feeling like I'm being watched out there. I'm getting kind of goosebumps talking about it. And, and it takes a lot to rattle me. I've been in a couple crappy places in the world, rough deployments. I'm a combat wounded guy, and I've had my brain rattled a few times. So, I kind of like don't necessarily trust myself sometimes when I'm out there. Like, there's times where you can think, a black squirrel's a huge buck, or, blue jay is something, so I'm always kind of skeptical of things. And I and it was just getting dark, and I was like, I kind of came to this conclusion, and through hearing stories, I was like, the nighttime's not mine anymore. I don't just aimlessly walk around like I used to, with one eye shut and just, being out there. But I was in the swamp longer than I felt comfortable, and I was like, I got this last little bit of light, and I've got to get up to my barn. And it's a path that comes out, and then I hit a bean field, take a left, walk the bean field up, go up the hill, and then I'm back at my barn, and it's safe zone. So I turn my red headlamp on, and it shows eye shine really good if I see a deer or anything. And when I get up to the bean field, and it's really getting hazy, I get up to the bean field just about maybe 20 yards in front of me, and it looked to be about 10 foot tall, just one red, large eye shine. And I just got wide-eyed, and I hit my white light, and there was nothing there. And I turned that light back off, and I got freaked out. And I was like, all right, I'm out of here. I was like, thanks, everybody, for playing along, and I'm just heading home. Thanks for letting me give you garlic or whatever, check my cameras, and talking the whole way up. And I get up to the barn. It's like huge sense of relief. I'm back in home base, and I was like, man, I just couldn't stop thinking about that squirrel and what type of athleticism it would take to grab a red squirrel. They're just, like a red squirrel, if it came running at a full-grown human, you're like, whoa, they're just squirrely, for lack of a better word. And I said it out loud. I was like, hey, that squirrel, as the relief came in, I was like, oh, that was impressive. And right from the valley, right behind my barn, there was a chirp. My dad does a squirrel chirp. I can't do it, but it's like a whistle chirp. Sounds just like when a squirrel does one little blast. And it sounded like it was on a PA system. And just whoop, right after, I was like, that was impressive. And I was like, all right, good night. We're going inside. And, I've slept with one eye open for a long time. But I guess to wrap it up, what I've kind of taken from these experiences that I've been having there is like, I get a strange sense of comfort, and I feel like I have a safe place that these beings might travel through. And I would really like to keep it that, because, I've been out there by myself for a long time, and if anything wanted to hurt me, it had a million chances. And obviously, I've never laid eyes on anything. I've had some things that I just made the conscious decision not to look at out of the corner of my eye. But, they could have me at any time. And I feel like we have a little bit of an understanding. And, people scare me. Yeah, thanks.
So when you talk about Rene Dehinden and John Green, what it leads into, or what you can't divorce yourselves from, is the fact that the pinnacle of their work was the PG film. That was their thing. Even though Rene Dehinden at one time had the rights to the footage, and which has been transferred to his two living sons, and Green was always interested. And once Rene passed before John Green, and that Green kind of put that film up on YouTube and stuff, and so everyone can see it, which I think is a wonderful idea, because a lot of people have done a lot of things and a lot of things on YouTube. I wanted to show you some images of John Green and Rene Dehinden. As far as I know, this was the last time I saw John Green living. John Green is to the left, and his book, the 1978 book, Sasquatch, the Apes Among Us, is really one of the best pieces of literature that you could get in your personal library. And if you go on eBay or Craigslist or whatever the case might be, the hardback version has gone through the roof in terms of price. So if you bought it like I did back in 1978 when it first came out, in 1978 I was still living with my folks, and I was making lawnmower money, so that was my allowance. So it was, I think I remember it was $12.99, and that was on sale at the time. So I bought a copy. So those books you can't even touch for under $100, a good, clean copy of that book anymore. They're not cheap, but it's probably one of the best pieces of literature or books that you could ever dive into. John Green was a trained journalist from school, Columbia University, and so not only did he write well, but he wrote very effectively and was able to communicate to his audience about all the data that he had collected. So that's him to my left, and to the right is Bob Gimlin, who was with Roger when they got the famous movie. And I'm in the center there, and this was shot in September of 2003 in Willow Creek, California, when they had a very well-known Bigfoot conference there, and all the big people were there. So I just brought this slide up for you so you could see what John Green looked like later in life. And physically, he was, I guess he was about 6'3", so he was a tall and lanky individual, and his humor was very dry, and he was a very factual person, a kind of a no-nonsense person. So one thing that we don't realize about John Green that isn't really mentioned in his book is that because in 1976 there was no internet in place, not to the public. And so him and a fellow by the name of Dennis Gates, they took his vehicle, which was a Volkswagen bus, and he went cross-country through the United States and Canada, talking with eyewitnesses personally to find reports. So that's how you did it back then. And so that says a lot about him, because at the time his children were still small, and so his wife was raising the 5 children as he was on the road doing the research for the book. And that back then, that's how you did it, because you just couldn't jump onto a website and say, well, here's all the data for Mississippi, or here's all the data, the reports coming out of Florida. He physically went there. So that says a lot about him. And so that's what he did, and in 78 was his last big, tremendous book, and I hope that one day that you hopefully get a copy of it. So there's John Green again, and ahead of him is one of the people that is famous for the Al Berry tapes. That is Al Berry. Al Berry and Ron Moorhead got the Sierra sounds. That's him in 2003. The fellow that you see just ahead of that is the Russian investigator who wrote a very excellent book on the PG film, and it was his opinion, based on his studies, that the PG film was 100% authentic. He's since passed away, and that was just a few years ago. This is my first time up to, it's always nice to have a story, but it's always better to have documentation behind it, because when I say that I've been into Bigfoot or in the field for this long, that's me, that's 1980, that's Richmond, British Columbia, standing next to Rene Dehinden. So what is that, 40 some odd years ago, 42 years ago, almost? So that's me back then when I first went up to meet him. And so I'll tell you the story about that, about the Cibachrome images that came from the PG film. That was his doing, and a fellow by the name of Bruce Bonney. And so a lot of these images you could now see on the internet because people have put them up there. Mostly unauthorized because that's copyrighted material. But let me just tell you the backstory about that, because I am talking about the 2 famous investigators, Rene Dehinden and John Green. So in 1978, they had the famous UBC conference. Rene Dehinden was there, John Green was there, and a fellow that wrote for Surfer magazine, who was an expert photographer by the name of Bruce Bonney, was there with some really nice camera equipment. So at that time, in May of 1978, Rene was introduced, or perhaps Bruce Bonney introduced himself to Rene Dehinden. And so they got together and started collaborating a little bit. And I guess because of Bruce Bonney's expertise in cameras and film and that kind of stuff, Rene kind of started throwing ideas at him. And he says, I have access to the original PG film, Patterson-Gimlin film, which at the time was in Los Angeles. And so he told Bruce this, and he says, I guess I don't know all the details of the conversation, but it must have went like, wouldn't it be nice to get some of the best frames from that 954 frame movie film, the best frames, and get really tight shots of not all the background, but just the subject in it. And so they got about a dozen of those. They came down to Los Angeles to do this work. And so unbeknownst to me, because back then there was no internet, there was no social media, none of that, and both of them were extremely tight-lipped. Because what happened, and this was on a school day because I distinctly remember this, and I was usually in bed pretty early, 9 to be up at like by 7 or a little before 7 to be at school at 8 o'clock. So Bruce Bonney, by then I already knew who Bruce Bonney was. He jingles me up and he says, I'd like to come and visit you. And I said, sure. So we were up till about 1 a.m. in the morning. And in high school, I had perfect attendance. So I dragged myself out of bed the next morning to get to school. But it was very fun to visit with him. Never once did he mention to me what he was doing in Los Angeles. And so he, being the photographer and the expert, I guess the film was with an attorney, and they checked it out because they had legal authorization to do so, because Rene Dehinden at the time owned 51% of the film. He was the majority holder in it. The other holder was Patricia Patterson, Roger Patterson's widow. And so he had the legal right to see that film because it was his property at the time, because there was some litigation, and somehow Rene found his way to become an owner of the film. So it wasn't Rene who actually saw the film, it was Bruce Bonney. And so Bruce, with his expertise in camera work and stuff, he was able to get the close-up images from the original film to make the Cibachrome images of what Ken showed up here, the close-up of the subject, where you just see the subject. The reason why those images are so clear and sharp is because they don't come from a first-generation film, they come from the original. And that makes a world of difference. So that was the work, I could say it was mostly the work of Rene Dehinden because he was one of the owners of it, but Bruce was the technical person who was able to get in there and do the work. Bruce Bonney is still living, but very old and has nothing to do with Bigfoot anymore. But that's what Rene Dehinden contributed to the film. And so I wanted to mention, too, at the time, and maybe here in Michigan there might be some places like that here. Rene Dehinden lived on a gun club, the Vancouver Gun Club. And by then he was divorced, and his 2 kids were living away, and he lived in a trailer. And so what he did for the gun club to kind of earn his keep to stay there was he collected the shot in the field. When they would shoot, he would collect the lead shot and bring it back, recycle it, and resell it to the shooters. And so that helped everyone out, and that was kind of what he did at the gun club to stay there. And so his income was not really a lot. He didn't make a whole lot of money, but he was basically living for free and following his passion in Bigfooting. And so when the film came out in '67, and Rene found out about it immediately within the next day when he was in Willow Creek, and then he went up to Yakima, Washington to see the original film. But Rene was under the impression that that film would get a lot of attention here in the United States. It got very little attention. In fact, it got somewhat of a bad reputation. And so Rene said to me one day, and I said, well, why did you go to Europe and take the film and copies of the film to show all these scientists? And basically, he said, because nobody here in North America gave a S about it. And so he, as a very famous Bigfooter, he says, I'm going to go on the road, take it to more qualified people in Europe and Russia, and have them look at it and have them do papers and get their idea on it. And so the reason why I give him a lot of credit, he wasn't selling Bigfoot t-shirts or anything like that. He was just a Bigfoot researcher that was using his own money to fund his research. And so his trips going to the Soviet Union, he spent about a month out there. It was all on his own dime. And that really says something to me, that he took his own money to do what he had this tremendous passion for, to have the films scientifically analyzed, because in North America it was pretty much being rejected, over in Europe and over in Russia. And so that's his big contribution to Bigfooting. And it's just like, you see the Cebachrome prints floating up on YouTube or wherever the case may be, it was because of Rene Dehinden. And then all of the measurements and stuff that you might see every once in a while when you're surfing on the web, again, that was Rene Dehinden, because he probably went down to the PG Film site at least 7 times to pull measurements of the trees, because he was not formally educated. But he knew that if I measure all these trees and kind of figure out where the subject was in relationship to the camera, he knew that there were people smarter than him that have math backgrounds could possibly figure out how tall the subject is, etc., etc. And so the documentation of that information was very important, and that's what he did. And so that, he did a lot of things. He was involved in Bossberg, and so let me tell you a little bit about that. He was involved with a fellow that, by the name of Ivan Marks, who was involved in hoaxing films and hoaxing data in general. But that doesn't mean that, how can I say it? That doesn't mean that a bank robber can't return a purse if he found one. You see? So on this instance, when the Bossberg tracks were found, they were driving the roads up in Bossberg, Washington, which is northeastern Washington, in late 1969, and there were reports of this Bigfoot thing being in that area, and it was snowing. And so Rene told me that, he says, we saw the tracks on the side of the road in the snow at about the same time. So just because you're in the vehicle with a known hoaxer doesn't mean that what you're looking at is a hoax. Does that come across okay? I mean, it doesn't, just because you're with a known hoaxer doesn't mean. So they got out of the vehicle, and Rene counted 1,069 tracks, and he also had his movie camera with him. And so these are the early days of Bigfooting, where most people weren't really involved, or they had other things to do in their lives, and it wasn't center stage. And so he told me, face-to-face conversation, and he's got this on his movie film. He says, there came a point when I saw the tracks in the snow were right next to one another, like standing. And he said you could see yellow right in between them. And he said, I got the impression that this thing urinated right there and then started walking again. And right in that area is Lake Roosevelt Dam. And those tracks eventually, and there was a ramp there, a boat ramp that went down. And the weather was pretty cool. And that this wasn't reported by Dehinden, but this was reported by the newspaper. And Rene was also involved in the whole thing, as was Roger Patterson at the time. But I want to talk about Rene. And so what the newspaper reported is that eyewitnesses saw, when the tracks came to the boat ramp, that whatever was on those feet pretty much skied down on their feet right into the frigid water. So here's the thing. When you're a real researcher and you start digging and digging and digging, taking the deep dive to find out all the nuts and bolts about the case, you realize that if this was a hoaxer, this is just mad for someone to be doing that, to go down, ski on their feet right into the river that's freezing, that was snow covered, and it just doesn't make any sense. And so the only thing you could come back to is that more than likely the Bossberg incident was real. in spite of the fact that Ivan March was associated with it and was a known hoaxer. And like I said, even a bad person could return a purse to someone that lost their purse, or whatever the case may be. So that's Rene. And Rene had a very salty, you may have seen him on television. He was associated with some kokanee commercials. It was towards the later point in his life. He died in 2001. Towards the late 1990s, he became a minor celebrity for starring in these kokanee beer commercials. And I don't have any up here, but you could probably go to YouTube and see some of them. And so it kind of made him, his son said that it really kind of re-energized him, because that was the tail end of his research, and that was like another shot in the arm for him to validate what he was doing. And he did a lot of work, and most of his research material now is with his sons. And so let's go back to 1970 when he was at the PG film site. So he took his equipment with him, and he's looking at the film site with a copy of the film, with the film reels. Remember, this is film, not videotape. And he took 2 nails to a 2x4 and stuck it in, and he's just basically looking at the film with a viewfinder, trying to match the film to the film site which he's on. And so he looked at a certain location, and we'll talk about this later in my second presentation, but there was a piece of wood. And I kept telling Rene, I said, "You mean a branch, Rene?" And he says, "No, a piece of wood," meaning that this was a piece of wood, something that was from a lumber yard or whatever, that was discarded or whatever, because that Patterson-Gimlin film site was next to a dirt road, a gravel road, that they used to take the logging trucks on, and the PG film site was big enough that you could turn around on. And so that may have been a turnaround point, and so it would be logical that some of the debris would be left there. But this piece of wood turns out to be the linchpin that ties Patty to the piece of wood in terms of how tall she is. And so as he was looking through this film, he's seeing that piece of wood. The film was shot in October of '67, so he's there in the summer of '70, and he sees this piece of wood exactly where Patty had walked, and he says, "You know what? The first thing he thought, I'm going to take that piece of wood home as a souvenir, because he saw on the film that Patty stepped on it." And it was just a souvenir to begin with, but later proved to be, because it is in the same film plane. Imagine for a moment that this piece of blue tape, which most people can't see, is the piece of wood. If I'm standing next to it, it becomes a ruler to measure me, because it's a 1-to-1 ratio. If I were standing over here, it wouldn't be so much, but if I were standing here, that's a 1-to-1 ratio. And you could use that piece of wood to measure the unknown subject. I don't mean to critique Ken too much, but he did mention Patty and the origin of the name. And so Roger Patterson's widow is Patricia Patterson. She's still living in Yakima, Washington. It's not named after her. It's not, Patricia is often short Patty. So it's not named after her. It's named after Patterson, but in the female sense, because the person who coined that term was the Russian Dmitry Bayanov. So he said, instead of Patterson, because we see the breast on the subject, that we would feminize the word. Pat could be either a boy or a girl, but generally Patty is a female. So he said he coined it Patty, and so Patty has stuck ever since. And so he gets credit for naming the subject in the movie film. There's another shot of John Green, September of 2003 in Willow Creek, California. So he gave a very good presentation there talking about his life work. And he basically summarized that we should continue on in spite of the fact that we have no proof that Bigfoot is real, but to continue on with what we were doing. And there's John again, September 2003, signing an autograph. He signed a lot of autographs there. And that is Rene Dehinden in Bluff Creek, and that's about 1985, and that was probably towards the conclusion of the last time that he was in Bluff Creek on the PG film site doing his work. And taking measurements is super important. And so that's what he did, and that's what he contributed. And John Green, being the journalist, he was the guy that wrote the books, and as we can see now, his book, by the majority of Bigfoot people, is one of the best out there, and that was published long ago in '78, and it still stands the test of time.